My name's Joey, and I'm the co-founder of Beyond the Bell Tours, which designs inclusive historical walking tours of Philadelphia. We have two cornerstone tours, the Badass Women's History Tour of Philadelphia and the Gayborhood Tour. Our mission is to put people back into people's history. And so that is what we'll do today on this virtual LGBTQ history tour. I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the queer folks who have formed the city that we know and love. But before I start, I just wanted to ask you guys what you think of when you think of pride. And if you want to put something in the chat and let me know like what comes to mind when you think of pride. Rainbows. All right, thank you. There's parades, parties, celebrating who you are. Yeah, thank you all for reminding us of what we're missing out on. The smiles, yeah. Very celebratory, very festive, pride, love, human rights. Cool, yeah. Yeah, so it's in the conversation about pride, one of the things we ask is where did it begin? And the answer is it started as a protest, which I'm sure y'all have seen around social media. There's a lot of conversation about the contributions of Black trans women to our celebration of pride today, and kind of returning to that idea of pride as a fight for human rights, and a fight against police brutality. In Philadelphia, we have our own pride flag, our own rainbow flag, which is called More Colors, More Pride. And it was a project that was implemented by the city of Philadelphia. It's the only time in US history where a city government has created a symbol for LGBT equality. And so the original rainbow flag was just made by an individual. And the Philly Pride flag was made by the city of Philadelphia. And so what does it mean that we fly this flag at City Hall? You know, it's pretty cool that Amber Hikes, who's in this red suit, you can see her on the side of the picture. She was able to take this stance for the city and with the city, to say that if you are a Black and brown person in the queer community, we see you and we're here representing your voice in the city. And it's not, you know, it's in response to a lot of the history of racism in the neighborhood. But I just wanted to start the tour today by talking about our Philadelphia's story of police brutality, which can be illustrated in the story of Niza Morris. Niza Morris was a trans woman and was very involved in the drag community in Philadelphia. I don't know how many of you know of Bob and Barbara's, the bar, but Bob and Barbara's is a historic dive bar in Philadelphia and is famous for creating the citywide special, which is just a trivia fun fact for you. But they also, in addition to creating this institution of a drink, they also have hosted drag night for like decades. And so Niza was a drag queen at Bob and Barbara's and very, very well known. I went into the Ritz-Carlton before COVID happened, and someone who worked there was telling me that they knew Niza, and she'd always come into the Ritz-Carlton after a night for a drink, and she'd always have something witty to say to them. And so I think she was kind of a fixture in like the Rittenhouse area in nightlife. And so her story goes like this. Basically, she goes out one night and she gets really intoxicated and her friends want to send her home, but she stumbles out of the bar and she falls on the ground and people are concerned. So they call an ambulance to take her to the hospital, and a police car intercepts the ambulance and says, "Call it off, I'll give her a courtesy ride." And she says to the officer, I don't want to go to the hospital, I'd rather go home. And she is found on the side of the road, three blocks away from that site with a head wound. And a second person calls of police to get her to the hospital, and the ambulance comes and they take her to the hospital, but she ends up dying. And so that in itself, is a complex sequence. But then what happens afterwards is that the police who escorted her did not request permission to do an escort, which they need to do. They have to call their boss and say, can I escort this person instead of ambulance? And they didn't do that. So there's no record of the escort happening. And so it's not official. And so when people were calling for questioning what happened on that ride, there was no record of it. And so the police department and sort of that officer hid any sort of evidence that would help us figure out what happened, which is sketchy, right? It's just like sketchy to try to hide something like that. And then what happens is the police department says they don't have enough evidence to open up an investigation, and the medical examiner rules this a homicide. They say this was not a natural death, and she died of a head wound that night. So there was a lot of backlash, people calling for justice for Niza, because, like I said, she was kind of a fixture in the Rittenhouse drag scene, nightlife scene, so she was really missed. Additionally, she was a leader in the trans Buddhist community, which is kind of interesting. I like to think of our like spiritual leaders and as really special, and someone you definitely miss. And so that's a little bit about our story of police brutality, is that Niza's life and death have not been resolved in between the city and her community. So we're still kind of calling for justice for Niza, but I like to monumentalize her in our tours, just to remind us of this wonderful woman who shaped the queer community. This is a little piece that was done this year in 2020 in a collaboration between Visit Philly and Streets Department. 10 artists were commissioned to portray two historical figures that are women that they love. And so Niza was selected, and Niza was depicted on the side of Giovanni's Room bookstore. And one of her quotes that people knew her for was, when you're making a tough decision, to ask yourself, what is the most loving thing to do? And I think we can also take that away from Niza. These words of wisdom definitely make me, like, in my heart, I'm like, oh, choose the love. That's a beautiful message for Pride. Okay, another mother figure in the queer community in Philadelphia is Barbara Giddings, who I would get tattooed on my body. And she's just amazing. She's considered the mother figure of the LGBT rights movement in Philadelphia. And in queer history, oftentimes the stories of women are overlooked for a number of reasons. We're not really going to talk about the reasons today on the tour, but we are going to talk about Barbara Giddings. She was a worker. She was doing the grunt work of a lot of activism. She was making picket signs. She staged the first picket protest for LGBT rights in front of the Liberty Bell in 1965. They're called the Annual Reminder Days. So she stages them at the 4th of July parade afterwards, right at the Liberty Bell, right? This like historic site where we talk about American history. And we talk about the fight for civil liberties, like women's rights to vote. We're celebrating 100 years in 2020 of the right to vote for women. So she connects gay rights to the history of civil rights by placing this picket at the Liberty Bell. Super smart, like super smart placemaking woman, Barbara Giddings. She does this for 4 years. People come to the Liberty Bell and they picket. She's kind of criticized for this because the theory of the protest was, we look just like you, which is not what Pride is about today, right? Pride is like, we don't look like you, we're wearing leather, we're kinky, but that's fine because people have sex and that's totally fine. But this was like, we are getting fired from our jobs for being gay. And so we want to look employable. We want to look like respectable and dignified. And they did that within the strict confines of gender norms of the time. So she's wearing this dress, this like stripy dress, and she would never have worn that in her whole life. She would have always worn pants. She was just not a dress person in any way. But she wore it for this protest to say, like, this is about being seen as human, and so we have to move the needle. So 4 years later of doing this, Stonewall happens in New York, and she wants to go to Pride. So when the first Pride parade happens in New York, it's a year after Stonewall. It's to celebrate Stonewall. And so she stops doing the annual reminders and she buses people to New York to take part in the first Pride parade there. So after the annual reminders, she decides that to move the needle, doctors need to stop putting people in conversion therapy. They need to stop thinking that being gay is a mental illness. And so she creates this panel at the American Psychiatric Association's annual meeting. And she says, this is your problem. Like, you guys need to consider what it means that you're classifying homosexuality as a mental illness. And she gets a psychiatrist to come out at the meeting. You know, she's like doing all of this background work to orchestrate this event, which is just a panel, you know, like how could you I'm just admire her because how can you get excited about organizing a panel? You know, we all need to hear that. Like, it's just that this moment changed history, and she didn't know that at the time, but she gets this psychiatrist to come out, and his name's John Fryer, and he's sitting 2 people next to her with a mask on, totally disguised, and he disguises his voice with like a modulator in front of the microphone. And he tells everyone that he's a gay psychiatrist and that you are all wrongly, you're wrong about this illness. It's not being gay that's the problem. It's your environment that affects you when people are homophobic. You know, if people are raiding your bars, if you're getting fired from your job, of course you're going to have higher rates of anxiety and depression in this community, but it's not about being gay. And so, you know, he's masked, but my favorite part of this story, the next year, the president of the APA flies to Philadelphia and says, we're removing homosexuality from the list of mental disorders. So it worked, it was very effective. But John Fryer, until his dying day, says nobody knew it was him, the guy behind the mask. So he doesn't let people know immediately. Even after it works, he keeps it a secret to his dying day. And everyone's like, John, we knew it was you. You're 6'5" and 300 pounds. You're like the only psychiatrist in the country who fits this description. So I just love that because my therapist is always like, are you sure that story you're telling about yourself is true? And here we have this psychiatrist who's lying about what people know about him. But Barbara is one of the better memorialized women in Philadelphia. She doesn't have a statue, but she is memorialized in this mural on the side of the William Way LGBT Community Center, which is kind of a riff off the archival image. Locust Street is nicknamed Barbara Giddings Way in the neighborhood, and she has a plaque at her house at 21st and Locust where she lived. And this is her temporary mural that was put up in 2020 by Marissa Vasquez. Okay, how are you guys feeling? It's a lot of like details. Good? Okay. Do you have any questions? Does everything make sense?
So Joey, the only thing I was going to add is there is a group in Wayne that is doing a documentary
Huh.
on the last short story that you just shared. And when the American Psychiatric Convention was supposed to be in person in Philadelphia, they were also going to do a play version
Wow.
of that story. So they were going to reenact it
Wow.
for the current Academy of Psychiatric Convention that was happening in Philadelphia again this year, which I'm pretty positive has been canceled at
Yeah.
this stage. But so the good news is that while I heard that story first with you guys, when you did our tour for the global gathering,
Mhm.
it is the word's getting out and the
Very
story is
cool.
getting shared. So.
That is so exciting. Love Barbara. Love love that story. Love that story. Um, Thank you for sharing. Yeah, if anyone else has like personal relationships to any of the content, feel free to chime in as well. Um, okay, this is Kiyoshi Kuromiya. Kiyoshi um, I call him the Benjamin Franklin of queer history in Philadelphia because he just was so active his entire life. So many contributions, it would be impossible to list them all. He was born in Wyoming in a Japanese internment camp, and he was about 5 years old when his family got out of the camp and moved to a suburb in LA, where at the age of 11, he was arrested for cruising on a playground with a 16-year-old boy. And I love that because in interviews about this experience, he says, to be fair, I looked old for my age. And I'm like, how does an 11-year-old look old enough to cruise? But also just hilarious that he was like out and cruising at the age of 11. Incredible, incredible. Um, he comes to Philadelphia. He's very, very smart. So he gets into every college he applies to and he chooses Penn. And I really like his reason that he says he chose Philadelphia. He chose UPenn because of the city. And he chose the city because of the colony's history, that this was the first secular colony. It was a place that championed religious freedom and free thinking by design. And he was an architecture student. So he was really interested in design philosophy. And so he chose Philadelphia for that reason. And I think Philadelphia chose him in that like eternal kind of way. He staged a really interesting anti-war protest at the Van Pelt Library in the 60s. He was a student at Penn, and he staged this protest where he printed out tons of flyers telling people that he was going to napalm a dog alive, just like they were doing in Vietnam to Vietnamese folks. He was going to do it to a dog outside of Penn's campus. And he printed out like hundreds and hundreds of flyers, which this was the 60s. This was not like Xerox, this was not like copies and copies and copies. This was like hand printing, cutting stencils, like this like labor. He was laboring and laboring to try to make this protest happen. And thousands of people showed up. It was the largest attended anti-war protest in the country for Vietnam. And thousands of people showed up and they found a message from him that said, congratulations on your anti-napalm protest. You just saved the life of a dog. Now, how about saving the lives of tens of thousands of people in Vietnam? Just gonna leave that there. Kiyoshi, just very incredible, incredible protest, nonviolent as well. He was very, very close with Martin Luther King Jr. After Dr. King was assassinated or murdered, Kiyoshi left Philadelphia and went and stayed with Martin's family. They were really, really close family friends. So he took care of the kids a little bit after Martin Luther King's death. And I think Kiyoshi's or peaceful activism can be connected to the Black radical freedom movement through his relationships with Black leaders. He also took a really interesting stance at the Black Panther Convention, which happened in Philadelphia. And when it was happening, people in the gay community were really critical of the Black Panthers. They called them homophobic. They said they weren't in support of gay rights. And Kiyoshi said, it's true that the Black Panthers are homophobic, but they're not more homophobic than anybody else. They're just not gay. Like, it is anti-Black to single out an organization that's fighting for freedom because they reflect the attitudes of the broader society. And so Kiyoshi really wanted to fight to cross that bridge with the Black Panthers. And so he was the gay delegate to the Black Panther Convention. And he gave a speech there in which he talked about the need for crossing the aisle and working together between the Gay Liberation Front and the Black Panther Party for human rights for all. And the Black Panthers actually made a donation to the Gay Liberation Front because of his speech. And so there's just this interesting intersectionality that he recognizes is important in the fight for freedom and human rights, that I think in the LGBT community today, we can really learn from Kiyoshi. This is Alain Locke. He looks stunning in this photo. But he was the first African-American Rhodes Scholar, period, in 1902. People rumored that Oxford didn't know what they were doing, that they accidentally accepted a Black man, because when he got to Oxford, he couldn't get in anywhere. The way that the Rhodes Scholarship works is you get the trust, like, funds your education, so they select you. It's very prestigious. So usually people just have to apply to their top choice college at Oxford and they just get in. But he got the scholarship and then was denied everywhere. And so the Rhodes Trust had to intervene on his behalf to get Oxford to make an exception to have him as a student, which was crazy because he was the top student at Harvard. And so there was no academic questions. It was just about his race. And it's because a group of other American Rhodes Scholars gathered together and told Oxford that they would not attend if they accepted him. And so it was a really formative time for Alain Locke. When he got to Oxford, people were not friendly. You know, it was a really hostile environment. People staged walkouts when he walked into the room. And so he decided he was wasting his time. And so he traveled around Europe, and he had an affair with Langston Hughes, and he just was like chasing boys and writing his philosophy, and really interesting guy. I wish that I were in Paris at the time and I was like on Tinder. But Alain Locke comes back to the US after leaving Oxford. He finishes his PhD at Harvard. And then he gets in debates with Black leaders about how to create Black scholarship that could be taught at places like Oxford. He becomes really obsessed with this idea that he didn't belong at Oxford because no one paved the way for him to belong there. And so he really wanted to right that wrong. And so he created this anthology called The New Negro, which was full of works of like literature, poetry, essays that were all by Black writers and thinkers. And so he creates this foundational text and becomes known as one of the father figures in the Harlem Renaissance. And he's pretty well memorialized in the city. you know, in gay history, we don't have a lot of people who get statues. And so we put our murals on the side of gay bars. And this is on the side of a gay bar called Writer's Block Rehab, which is the only gay bar in the city that's owned by people of color. It's owned by a gay Asian couple. And I actually really like it in there. It's really cute. They wanted to make a space that was kind of an alternative to the dancey vibe of other gay bars. It's kind of a place to go. You can read a book or take a date or a family member or something for like a quiet night. Okay, maybe I'll end with the story of Charlene since it's 6:45 now. But so Charlene, if any of you have heard of her, she was local to Philadelphia by way of Mississippi, where she was born. She came to Philly and started doing transition therapy with a doctor in Philadelphia who was one of the foremost doctors in trans competent care at the time in the 90s. And she really wanted to create more knowledge of trans competent care because it was so selective. She had to find this one doctor in the city. Most people were like going to Canada at the time or going north to get their trans therapy. And so she created a conference, which was called the Trans Health Conference. We now know it as the Trans Wellness Conference. It started as a one-day thing that brought physicians together to train each other on trans competent care. And it grew and grew and grew. The Mazzoni Center grew it, took it over. And there's their flag for the Trans Wellness Conference right by City Hall. And now it's at the Convention Center. It's a 3-day conference. It was going to happen in July. I think it's probably canceled this year as well, or, you know, online to some extent. But now it brings over 11,000 trans folks to Philadelphia every year. So it's really put Philadelphia on the global map in terms of trans friendliness and trans inclusiveness. And so we have a lot to owe Charlene for her contributions to the city's identity. She also got on a SEPTA bus when she was younger, and SEPTA monthly passes used to have gender markers on them. So you'd have to select your gender when you bought a pass, and it would come printed with an M or an F. And so she got denied on a bus, and she had to pay the $250 or whatever. So she's like, fine, I'm not having this today. Don't mess with me. So she goes back to SEPTA, gets a new pass with a different marker, gets on another bus, they deny her again. And so she's like, oh, I just don't pass for either gender. This is just transphobic. It's like the only thing that's happening. And she fights SEPTA on it. So she takes the issue to SEPTA. SEPTA says, if we take off gender markers, then wives will share with husbands and the world will end. And so they keep it on, they keep it on, they keep it on. She takes it all the way to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. Huge legal battle for SEPTA. They finally remove the gender markers, but one thing she does is she does a direct action where she fills Suburban Station with drag queens. She calls it SEPTA is a drag, and she has them all try to get on with their gender markers not matching their physical appearance, which I think is hilarious. And so take like the humor in that dire situation. That's just, you know, it's just amazing to me, the spirit of that.
And Joey, when was that actually passed? It was like ridiculously recent.
So recent, so drawn out. I think the original, like she took it to SEPTA in 2004, and then it passed like 7 years later or something like that. It's like took a ton of time. So yeah. and within the past 10 years, you know, it's not like, yeah. I mean, the Trans Wellness Conference was like going on concurrently.
Right.
Yeah, but yeah. So that is a little snippet of queer history.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I feel like I learned so much. I can't believe that that's so recent. I was like, oh, this was probably like years and years and years ago.
Yeah, crazy.
Wow. Actually, I do have a question for you.
Sure.
I've been, I just finished season 2 of Pose on
Okay,
Netflix.
cool.
Um, and because I like love it so much. And I was just wondering, because that's all about New York, like if there's any history on like the ballroom scene in Philly.
Oh, there's so much history of the ball scene in Philly. We didn't quite get there. Normally the tour is 2 hours, so it was a little bit of a stretch. Um, but yeah, Philly and New York's ball scene were rivals. So naturally, when you talk about New York, you don't talk about Philadelphia, you know? And same thing for us. Like, we don't talk about the New York ball scene when we talk about the Philly ball scene. But it was definitely thriving. Philly, I think, as a city, just developed in the shadows. You know, it kind of like the neighborhood was all built on alleyways. And because we're the historic capital and we're not the centerpiece of law and order like DC, and we're not the financial capital, I think things are kind of able to fly under the radar a little more in Philadelphia. And so the ball scene definitely benefited from that and kind of is emblematic of that. One of the house mothers that I talk about sometimes is Stacy Blahnik, who was one of the house mothers in the House of Blahnik. And her membership grew to over 150 people at its peak.
Wow.
Yeah.
Incredible.
Yeah, incredible. And there's this great woman, Gloria, who one of the things she did is her whole life was about bringing voices to the table who didn't have space there. And she is on the board of directors of the House of Blahnik. That's one of the positions she holds in her life, which I love.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Do we have any more questions? No?
Did anyone have like a favorite story? Favorite person?
I think the napalm dog guy is like my story. Yeah, that's just like so funny that he pranked everybody into like coming out and protesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, so clever.
It's so interesting the role that like humor plays in protest,
Mm-hmm.
which is like really fascinating. Cause like in Post, I won't spoil anything, but like in Post, like there's like a similar demonstration where like like the underlying, like there's humor in it, which I think is really unique to that community, which is not something you typically see in other protests or like demonstrations. So that's really interesting.
It's disarming, right?
I feel like we kind of saw that play out this past weekend with the rally that was happening in Tulsa, right? Like a bunch of like teenagers and people on social media like bought all these tickets, or not bought, but like signed up for all of these tickets for the event, and then you know, like didn't show. And that's like, I feel like kind of some people are calling it like a prank, but it's activism and it's like a form of protest, right? But it's also kind of funny and definitely a tinge of humor to it.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
Okay.
totally.
I love the love story, and find so both Natalie and I, like, don't be surprised, Joey, if it's not like the headline for a future Venture Cafe newsletter, because we were both like, you know, chatting behind the scenes like future Venture Cafe newsletter.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, the irony and so sad that someone who had that philosophy
Mm-hmm.
and embodied that philosophy died
Totally.
that
Yeah.
way, the way they did. I mean, that's just, you know.
No, it's totally, it is ironic. It is ironic that people who learn to use love to overcome so much often have hate used against them.
Yeah.
But I think as a society, you know, I find that really inspiring. You know, you don't see yourself in the cop, you know, you see yourself in Niza in that story. I think it's pretty inspiring. But yeah, definitely. And, you know, what pride is all about. Like, how do you hold yourself with dignity when everyone else is telling you that you're shameful for who you are?
All right. Well, thank you so much. I feel like we've all learned a lot. And I'm looking forward to hopefully more tours.
Yeah.
Those are awesome.
Yeah, hopefully when we can get back out there.
Yeah, sure.
All right. Well, happy Pride.
Happy Pride, Joe.
Happy Pride. Thank you.
Have a good night.
You too.
Bye.